Hi everyone, Patrick McClellan here, registered professional geologist. I've been licensed with the state of California now for over 35 years, formerly U.S. Geological Survey, and for 5 years in the San Leandro Fire Department as the city's first disaster preparedness director. For the last 25 years, been with First American and JCP Natural Hazard Disclosures. Today, it's all about AB 38. I want to give you a brief review about the home hardening disclosures that many of you have been dealing with for the last 5 months or so, and then introduce you to a new phase of disclosures under AB 38, the vegetation management and defensible space compliance disclosures. So you're all familiar with the psychology behind AB 38. You've seen it for decades here in California. I call it the earthquake model. We live in earthquake country. Older homes are more vulnerable to earthquake damage, but the government can't make you retrofit an older home to enable it to survive an earthquake. So they educate you about earthquake vulnerabilities and how to fix them. And then they mandate that the seller make disclosures to the buyer to encourage earthquake retrofitting. And the result of that 25 years ago was the Homeowner's Guide to Earthquake Safety, which is now a mandated pamphlet that a seller of a home built before 1960 has to deliver to the buyer. 1960 was when building codes changed to make homes stronger against earthquake forces. Well, if you just swap out earthquakes and swap in wildfire, you've got the psychology behind AB 38. We live in wildfire country. Older homes are more vulnerable to wildfires. The government can't force retrofits, so they educate people about wildfire vulnerabilities and how to fix them, and then they mandate seller disclosures. And that's what these home hardening disclosures are all about. Well, let's begin at the beginning. What is AB 38? It started out as legislation, Assembly Bill 38, and when it was approved by the state assembly and the state senate, it was passed on to the governor, who signed it and made it a statute or a law, and it was chaptered in the California Civil Code under section 1102.6F, and another part of it under section 1102.19 that I'll tell you more about a little bit later. AB 38 applies to residential construction of 1 to 4 units. It's in the same section of the Civil Code that requires the transfer disclosure statement. So in any transaction where a TDS is required, AB 38 also applies. Under certain conditions, AB 38 requires 6 different disclosures, and I'll go through each one of these separately, but just very generally, the first 2 of those disclosures are public information. So you're going to find those in most natural hazard disclosure reports. This would be the fire hazard zone determination and a notice to the buyer that I'll talk more about in just a minute. The other 4 of those disclosures are all about documentation, which is within the knowledge of the seller. So those are what we call seller's actual knowledge, and that's the concept that most agents are familiar with. The AB 38 requirements are being rolled out in phases depending on the effective date of those disclosures. The first effective date was January 1st, 2021. And this is when those home hardening disclosures became required that many of you have already had to deal with. Phase 2 of those disclosures becomes effective July 1st, 2021, just around the corner. And then 4 years down the road, another disclosure is required that I'll just briefly touch on since it's so far off into the future. Many of you are already familiar with the AB 38 home hardening disclosures because you've already been dealing with them now for several months. So I'm only going to summarize them here. But I want to start with this notice to the buyer because it contains 3 of the essential elements of AB 38. This first concept, high or very high, what does it refer to? Well, these are specific levels on the state's fire threat scale, which has been developed by the director of the Department of Forestry and Fire Protection, otherwise called CAL FIRE. And these threat levels are based on the kind of vegetation in an area, whether it's forest or chaparral or grassland, the shape of the landscape. The slope has a lot to do with how quickly wildfires can spread, and other conditions as well. So fire threat levels, high or very high. And this concept called fire hazard severity zone, this doesn't refer to city or county zones that might be designated by the city or county fire department. These fire hazard severity zones are specific mapped areas defined and bounded and identified by CAL FIRE also. And these designate a specific fire threat level. So for example, you can have a high fire hazard severity zone or a very high fire hazard severity zone on a CAL FIRE map. So that's what these fire hazard severity zones refer to. I refer to them throughout my slides with this acronym FHSZ. It's one of three acronyms that I want you to remember. I'll talk about the other two a little bit later on. The other concept that I want you to know about is the Wildland Urban Interface Building Code. This is also in the notice. This refers to a chapter of the California Building Code, Chapter 7A, that was added back in 2010. Well, that's why AB 38 refers to 2010, because older homes, those built before that chapter was added, didn't have the benefit of the wildfire safety requirements that are in Chapter 7A. And then at the bottom of the notice to the buyer is this web address, and I'm going to point back to this in just a few minutes here. And the home hardening disclosures, if the home was constructed before 2010, 3 disclosures became required effective January 1st, 2021. Talk about each one of these individually here. The first is a list of low-cost home hardening features. These are features of design and construction that promote wildfire safety. They include non-combustible roofing materials such as tile or metal or composition shingles, enclosed roof eaves to keep flames out from under your roof, screens on chimneys and rain gutters to keep leaves from accumulating that could be ignited by an ember and cause a fire that burns down your house, non-combustible siding, metal or stucco, double pane windows to resist the intrusion from the fire, and so forth. That list of low-cost retrofits can be downloaded from the CAL FIRE website at the web address in the notice to the buyer, or you can download it from our website under the electronic bookshelf. Now, older homes don't have many of those modern fire safety features, so they remain more vulnerable to wildfires. And under AB 38, if the seller is aware of any vulnerabilities on that list, they need to be disclosed to the buyer. The final inspection report, when a new home is completed or a remodel or renovation is completed, the building official comes out and prepares this final inspection report. It has some information in it that the buyer needs to be aware of. For example, it verifies which building code the home was constructed under. Was it before 2010 or after 2010? It establishes that the construction was done according to the plan that was approved in the building permit, and it documents compliance with certain building standards and regulations, such as those that promote wildfire safety. If the seller is in possession of that final inspection report or knows where to get it, that information also needs to be passed on to the buyer. Well, this seems like a lot of information for the seller to collect and organize for these disclosures, but as many of you know, CAR came to the rescue with its Form HHDA, the Home Fire Hardening Disclosure and Advisory. It made things pretty simple. It has a place for the seller to indicate the year of construction. Was it before or after 2010, for example? It includes this notice to the buyer in bold text. It includes the list of these home vulnerabilities, wildfire vulnerabilities, with a checkbox for each one of them where the seller can indicate awareness of any of those vulnerabilities, and a place at the bottom of the form to indicate the seller's awareness or possession of this final inspection report. This next disclosure is important because it's so timely. Its effective date is just around the corner, July 1st, 2021. It's about vegetation management, and specifically, it's about proving that your property is in compliance with state laws and local ordinances that require defensible space around structures. In short, AB 38 has made this proof of compliance with defensible space a mandatory disclosure. And I'm going to get back to this in more detail toward the end of the webinar. But first, let me just check off this last one. Phase 3 of AB 38 is about wildfire retrofits. It takes effect 4 years from now, but it's an issue that sellers often ask questions about. And that is, does AB 38 mean that I've got to retrofit my home before I can sell it? Well, I'm not a lawyer, but my reading of AB 38 doesn't indicate anything that requires a seller retrofit the home for wildfire safety. It does say this, and I'll read this. The notice shall disclose which listed retrofits, if any, have been completed during the time that the seller has owned the property. Doesn't say anything about the seller having to do any of those retrofits. If the seller has done any of them, then those retrofits need to be disclosed. So a frequent question is, how do I know if I'm in a fire zone where these new disclosures are required? Well, it all comes down to the language in AB 38. For example, high or very high fire hazard severity zones identified on maps drawn by the California Department of Forestry and Fire Protection. In another section, it says, the seller of any real property subject to this article that is located in a high or very high fire hazard severity zone as identified by the Director of California's Department of Forestry and Fire Protection. And it repeats that. So several times within AB 38, it specifies fire hazard severity zones on maps that are drawn by the state's fire service agency, which is CAL FIRE. So that's where AB 38 disclosures apply. Now, this is a good place to review these fire hazard severity zones for you. California is divided into 3 categories of fire protection responsibility. Our national parks and national forests are under the federal responsibility, where the U.S. Forest Service is the lead fire protection agency. AB 38 doesn't apply there to that federal responsibility area, but there are 2 other areas, the state responsibility area and the local responsibility area, where AB 38 does apply. And here's where I get to those other 2 abbreviations that I mentioned, SRA and LRA. SRA is the state responsibility area. This is where CAL FIRE has fire protection responsibility. And LRA is local responsibility, where a city or county fire department has the financial responsibility of responding to wildfires. And the map on the bottom is just a diagram to show the relationship between an SRA and an LRA. LRA is surrounded by this dashed line, SRA surrounded by the solid line. And you've been making an SRA disclosure for years. It's on the natural hazard disclosure statement at the front of your NHD report. You've been disclosing whether the property is in or not in the state responsibility area. But this says nothing about the fire threat levels within the SRA. A lot of people don't realize that the SRA is subdivided into 3 different fire threat levels. There is a moderate fire hazard severity zone, a high fire hazard severity zone and a very high fire hazard severity zone within the SRA. And under AB 38, if the property is in a high or very high fire hazard severity zone in the SRA, then these AB 38 disclosures apply. Now, CAL FIRE also recommends fire hazard severity zones to local responsibility areas, but it only recommends one fire threat level, and that is the very high fire hazard severity zone. It doesn't recommend a high or a moderate zone within the local responsibility area. So in summary, AB 38 applies if the property is within a high or very high fire hazard severity zone within the SRA or the LRA. So how do you know if your property is within one of these areas where the AB 38 disclosures apply? Well, you can find part of the answer on the statutory NHD statement at the front of your NHD report. It includes two different fire zone disclosures. The first is the local responsibility area disclosure. If that checkbox is marked yes, it means that you're in a very high fire hazard severity zone that's identified by CAL FIRE, and the AB 38 disclosures apply. If the second disclosure, which is the SRA disclosure, is marked yes, it means that the AB 38 disclosures may apply, but you just can't be quite sure about that. And that's because the SRA includes a moderate fire hazard severity zone that is not specified under AB 38. Now, the California Association of Realtors suggests that if you're in the SRA and the wildland disclosure is marked yes, that you can probably assume that you're in a high or very high fire hazard severity zone and that the AB 38 disclosures apply. However, they add that you may be over disclosing because of these moderate fire hazard severity zones also in the SRA. So we checked, we looked at the amount of area in California that is within the moderate fire hazard severity zones of the SRA. It turned out to be pretty significant. A little bit more than 1/4 of the area of the SRA is in a moderate fire hazard severity zone. And these areas include some pretty important real estate markets in California. For example, in the North San Francisco Bay Area, in the Placer and Sacramento County areas, rapidly developing, and along the Central Coast. So there's a lot of real estate in these moderate SRA fire hazard severity zones where you may be over disclosing. So what can you do about that? Well, you can use a reputable NHD provider that includes explicit determinations of whether you're in a high or a very high fire hazard severity zone within the SRA. And you'll typically find those disclosures in this report down in a section that's referred to as additional statutory disclosures. In this case here, you can see the fire hazard severity zone for AB 38 is distinguished in this disclosure, not in a high or very high fire hazard severity zone. At this point, I want to update you on a rapidly developing story. You may not be in a high or very high fire hazard severity zone right now, but that may change. The reason is that after the 2017 wine country fires in Sonoma and Napa counties and the 2018 Camp Fire in Paradise, it became pretty clear to most everybody that CAL FIRE's fire hazard severity zones didn't do a very good job of anticipating where a wind-driven wildfire could spread. And so CAL FIRE went back to the drawing board to retool its fire threat mapping technology and produce a new generation of fire hazard severity zone maps that was intended for release prior to the implementation of AB 38 last January. Well, along comes COVID, along comes last summer's record-setting wildfire disasters in California, and those maps got delayed. And so toward the end of last year, CAL FIRE said those maps should be released sometime in the spring of 2021. Well, here it is at the end of the spring of 2021, still no new fire hazard severity zone maps. We just got an update a few weeks ago letting us know that these new maps would go into review by local agencies probably during the summer and be released late this summer or early in the fall. So those new maps will identify not just where wildfires can start, but where they can spread to under the influence of 60 or 70-mile-an-hour winds. And that means that these fire hazard severity zones will be much larger than they are currently. So if you're not in a fire hazard severity zone now, you may be when these new maps are released later this year. Let's get back to phase 2 of AB 38, defensible space compliance. This is not in the same section as the home hardening disclosures, but in a different section, 1102.19. And it's the hottest disclosure out there right now because its timeline is immediate. Its effective date is July 1st. 2021. Now, AB 38 doesn't use this term defensible space in describing this new disclosure. It uses the term vegetation management, but the bottom line is the same thing. The goal is to create a defensible space around your home that protects the structure from flames and burning embers and protects the firefighters who come to defend your home during a wildfire. It's a buffer. This defensible space buffer is 100 feet wide away from the house, with a smaller buffer inside it 30 feet away from the house, in which the vegetation is more intensely managed and maintained. In that inner buffer, tree limbs have to be removed from overhanging the roof. Dead and dying tree limbs have to be cut back 10 feet from the chimney. Brush has to be trimmed away from the windows in the home, and other kinds of vegetation management within that 30-foot zone. Outside of that zone, annual grasses have to be kept below 4 inches in height, and tree limbs have to be cut away up to a certain height that prevents flames from jumping from the grass on the ground up to the treetops, laddering up the tree. So this is your defensible space zone. Laws have been in place for decades that require defensible space in high and very high fire hazard severity zones, but they just haven't been really aggressively enforced until recently. And AB 38 makes proof of compliance with these defensible space laws a required disclosure in home sales in high and very high fire hazard severity zones, or where local ordinances require proof of defensible space compliance. So how do you document compliance with a defensible space law? Through a defensible space inspection. And this is typically provided by your local fire authority. It could be your city fire department or a county fire protection district, or even CAL FIRE if you're in the SRA. What they'll do is come on your property, they'll compare your vegetation conditions with what the law requires, checking the boxes as they go. And when they're done, they'll deliver to you an inspection report, and that becomes your proof of compliance. On the right is an example of one of these inspection reports. It's what CAL FIRE uses, and it'll give you an idea of what to anticipate if you have an inspection on your property. And I'll leave a link to this form in the takeaway at the end of the webinar for you. Sometimes the first inspection is free. Sometimes the fire department will charge a fee for that first inspection, but all re-inspections typically are at a cost. So it's good to pass the inspection the first time to minimize the cost of that service. Now, an important point about the defensible space disclosure is that unlike the home hardening disclosures, which apply to homes built before 2010, the defensible space disclosures are not limited to homes of a certain age. They apply to homes of any age, regardless of the year built. And the reason for that is, of course, vegetation doesn't have an expiration date. It just keeps growing, and it needs to be continually managed and maintained. Where does the defensible space disclosure apply? Well, in the same places that the home hardening disclosures apply, in a high or very high fire hazard severity zone identified by CAL FIRE, in the SRA or in the LRA. But wait, there's more, and that is that cities and counties can be more restrictive than state law. A city or a county may regulate defensible space more strictly than CAL FIRE, and property owners must comply with those local laws. So, for example, a city may enact a local ordinance that requires vegetation management everywhere in its jurisdiction. And sellers and buyers, just like any other citizen or resident of that city, must comply with that local ordinance. So seller and buyer must comply with local ordinances, whether in a high or very high fire hazard severity zone or not. And if a local vegetation management ordinance requires proof of compliance, then that proof of compliance becomes a required disclosure under AB 38. So just as CAR came to the rescue with the home hardening disclosures, it's done the same thing with the defensible space disclosures. This old HHDA form that you've been using will go away on July 1st and be replaced by a new form, the FHDS form, the Fire Hardening and Defensible Space Advisory Disclosure and Addendum. It will replace the HHDA because everything that was on the HHDA is also on this new form. You see it at the top of the page circled in red. And then the disclosures for the defensible space compliance, those will be at the bottom of this new FHDS form. So CAR is making it as easy as possible for seller and buyer to navigate the complexities of AB 38 when it comes to documenting compliance with these defensible space and vegetation management laws and ordinances. Okay, so let's wrap this up. AB 38's defensible space disclosure is required in any high or very high fire hazard severity zone as identified by CAL FIRE, or where a local vegetation management ordinance requires defensible space compliance. So it comes down to a key question. Does my community require defensible space compliance? And how do I know? I'm going to explain this with a little bit of a civics lesson. And the only reason I know is because I spent 5 years in city government. We all know how a state law is made. The legislature proposes a new law, a bill, and both houses of the legislature, the Senate and the Assembly, vote and approve and pass it on to the governor, who then signs it, and it becomes a new law or statute that's chaptered in the state code. Well, it's the same process at the local level, but instead of the legislature, we have commissions. So, for example, the Planning Commission will say, we need a new ordinance to regulate hazardous vegetation on private property. Fire department, please provide us with a draft ordinance that we can consider. So the Planning Commission holds an open meeting, takes public comment, revises the draft ordinance as needed, and passes it on to the jurisdiction's governing board. At the county level, that's the Board of Supervisors. At the city level, it's the City Council. And they vote to adopt the ordinance. It becomes a local law that then is chaptered in the municipal code. Now, at every level of government in that process, there's an officer who keeps records on those new laws and ordinances. At the state level, it's the Secretary of State. At the county and city level, it's the county clerk and city clerk. And they have all these ordinances right at their fingertips. Sometimes the municipal code is available right on the city or county website. And for some cities, there's even an online ordinance database that you could very quickly look up vegetation management or defensible space. So if I'm an agent, I call up the city clerk and ask, does my city have a vegetation management ordinance? Clerk says, why, yes, the city council just passed it last week. Well, please send me a copy of that ordinance or send me the link where I can download it from your website so that I can share it with my real estate sellers and buyers. And boom, you're now the local real estate expert on AB 38's defensible space disclosure. And when you get that ordinance, be sure to read it and verify whether it includes a point of sale requirement. In other words, does the ordinance require the property owner to obtain documentation that the property complies with a defensible space regulation before the property can be sold? That can really complicate a transaction, so you want to get that proof of compliance as early as possible if that's the case. So now your seller or buyer is ready to schedule that defensible space inspection if the ordinance requires it. But who do they call? Typically, it's the local fire authority, but really, who is that? And don't dial 911 to find out. AB 38 is not an emergency. But in a real emergency, if you dial 911, who's going to roll up on your curb? Well, it's typically going to be a fire truck with firefighters and paramedics to assess and stabilize whatever the situation happens to be. Well, what name will be on the door of that fire truck? That is your local fire authority. It could be the city or county fire department or the county fire protection district or a regional district of CAL FIRE. Sometimes it's an inspector from the local building department, but that's kind of rare. But the point is, seller and buyer are going to be looking at the agent as the expert in local real estate to know who that local fire authority is. So if you don't already know, you probably should find out before July 1st. Okay, so finally, AB 38 is not the most clearly written law in California history. CAR has done its best to translate and simplify AB 38 with its form HHDA and the new one, the FHDS. But it's a complicated law. If you want a legal interpretation of AB 38 or reliable legal advice about any law, don't ask your NHD provider. Ask a legal expert, an attorney who can represent your interests. And that's why at the bottom of every slide that you've seen here in my webinar, there's this red disclaimer, consult your corporate counsel. I want to finish up with just some best practices for AB 38. First, use a reputable NHD provider that does these things. Many providers don't. Use a report that includes the AB 38 disclosure, a report that explicitly discloses CAL FIRE's high or very high fire hazard severity zones in the SRA, a report that relies on CAL FIRE's current official fire hazard severity zone maps, and a report that tells you specifically which maps were used to make those fire zone disclosures with. Second, call the city clerk or the county clerk to investigate whether a vegetation management ordinance exists in your territory where you do business. Third, obtain the proof of compliance early with regard to the defensible space requirements. A lot of people don't realize that a defensible space inspection has two possible outcomes. You can pass, here's your proof of compliance, proceed with your transaction, or you can fail. Here's a list of your violations. Now you've got 30 days within which to fix them. So if you fail, you can get out there and quickly clean up the property, do a lot of tree trimming and landscaping, or you can hire a contractor to do it for you. That gets expensive. We've heard cases of up to tens of thousands of dollars cleaning up a property for a defensible space inspection. And then you've got to schedule a re-inspection by the fire authority to come out and pass that one so that you can get that proof of compliance. And if you can't afford that, then the city or county can come in and do it for you and bill you for the services. If you can't pay that bill, they'll put a lien on your property. And nobody wants those costs and delays and red flags showing up on their transaction during the escrow period. It can delay closing. It can allow the buyer to rescind the offer or give the buyer an opportunity to negotiate the price downward. So if the ordinance requires it, get that proof of compliance early. So thanks for attending my webinar. I want to leave you with a takeaway of some useful AB 38 resources. It will include a copy of the AB 38 law, the actual text as it's chaptered in the state code, CAL FIRE's list of low-cost wildfire retrofits, and CAL FIRE's notice of defensible space inspection, the blank form, so that you can anticipate what a defensible space inspection might include in your area. And then a recommendation to check out CAR's new FHDS form, which translates and simplifies the AB 38 requirements, as well as the accompanying defensible space and fire insurance quick guides from CAR. And then also ask your First American or JCP sales representative to explain the AB 38 disclosures in the First American and JCP report. And finally, tune in to NHD Academy on the web to see our educational videos. There's 9 of them that cover California's natural hazard disclosures. And we'll see you later.